Since COVID-19, we have seen criminals taking advantage of geopolitical competition, technology, violent conflicts, as well as trade wars, and the erosion of democracy to expand their markets. The Global Organized Crime Index 2025, which encompasses the Africa Organized Crime Index, shows that the world is at a crossroads on dealing with illicit economies. Today, we're focusing on South Africa, considering the index as well as South Africa's criminal ecosystem within the global and African context, and then how the country can navigate the complex road ahead. Dr. Mark Shaw, the Executive Director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, will walk us through finding solutions in a fast-changing world, reflections on organized crime in South Africa. I, Ottilia Maunganidze, the Head of Special Projects for the Institute for Security Studies, will be your chair and moderator. We'll start with a presentation by Mark on organized crime in South Africa, and then we'll go into a discussion, both with our audience that are here in the room and those that are online. Mark, I hand you the floor.
Thanks, Ottilia. Good morning, everybody. I just need to set up the PowerPoint. That's correct. Is that okay? Good morning again. Thank you very much for everybody who's come out and everybody online as well. I'm going to present the Organized Crime Index, but through a South African lens, and also show you some new data crunching that we've done to give some sense of what might be possible in the South African context going forward. So I hope that's relevant. First point to say is to thank ISS very much, a long-standing partner of ours, a partner in the ENACT project, but also an organization that we have worked with a lot. ENACT has been an important project for the index, funded by the EU, and the index was developed in the context of Africa and then spread worldwide. This is the fourth sweep of the index, and you can see Norway put resources in the development phase, and the United States pays for the global work of the index. And we have a team around the world working on the index, plus a core unit in our headquarters, which is developing the index. I just want to begin by saying something about the methodology. And the key point to make about the index is, of course, it's a move from a qualitative overview of organized crime into one that is quantitative. And that's an enormous undertaking if you are doing it in all countries around the world. And we use a series of scoring thresholds, which experts take qualitative material and then score. And then there's a process of check and recheck and recheck and recheck. So in the context of South Africa, that would take place through a series of expert groups and expert inputs. It's an enormous undertaking. There's over 4,000 indicators. Up to 500 experts are used globally. And important for what I will present today, we collect and present information in three buckets. Firstly, criminal markets, and you can see some of them there, and we collect information around 15 criminal markets. That's not the full list. We've added some criminal markets, which I'll show you, so we don't have data for the full sweep. Criminal actors, 5 criminal actors. We've also added 1 private sector actors after comments from the first round of the index. The definitions are available. There's a complex sort of definitional process. And then resilience score, where we have 12 resilience indicators. And important for us is that we never wanted the index to be something where you would necessarily compare countries. I'm going to do that today, however. The idea is that every country has different levels of vulnerability, and so every country is different. The most obvious example is you can't have rhino crime if you don't have rhinos. All countries have different numbers of ports, different borders. So you're talking about very, very different entities. And so the index tries to bring that down to provide a portal to look at organized crime. And we position, as I will show you, organized crime scores against resilience scores in a matrix. Now, what are the global findings? And this is really a very, very quick introduction to the global findings. And then I promise you, I will go straight to South Africa. Over the course or the three global sweeps of the index, essentially the high level finding is that organized crime has continued to grow and that resilience has continued to decline or is relatively stable. So there are some countries that are an exception to that, but generally the slide is slightly disingenuous in the sense that this isn't a moving bar, but the overall point is to make that organized crime is growing and resilience in many countries around the world is stable or declining. And how does that look? And this matrix is important. We arrange the data on a matrix which has 4 quadrants: low criminality and high resilience. So 46 countries in the green, top left-hand corner, 72 countries in low criminality, low resilience, 66 countries in high criminality and low resilience, the red, the box you don't want to be in, and then 9 countries in high resilience, high organized crime. And if you look, what's occurred over the sweep of the index is that the green box has contracted, the red box, the one you don't want to be in, has grown, and the low criminality, low resilience has also contracted. The 9 countries in high criminality, high resilience have stayed the same. And those are very interesting countries for lots of reasons, as I will explain. Now, what is the overarching global scores? These are by region, so we measure across 22 regions around the world, and these are the measured crimes as assessed by the index in the latest round, which have grown. So cyber-dependent crimes have grown in 18 of 22 regions. We think, followed by financial crimes, and we think that this is very closely related to the rapid development of scam centers around the world. You can literally see the growth across the index, followed by the synthetic drug trade in 17 regions, the cocaine trade, given the enormous volumes of cocaine production in the Andean region, followed by fauna, so wildlife crimes essentially, followed by human trafficking, counterfeit goods, illicit trade in excisable goods, etc. So what emerges very clearly, I think, in the index is the very rapid growth, in particular, of the top 3, all of which have very important overall implications for, there's one seat here as well, all of which have very important implications for the extent and nature of organized crime globally. Now, how does South Africa compare to that? In the 3 sweeps of the index, and I sort of am going to start with the bad news and then hopefully move to what is better news. In the 3 sweeps of the index, you can see Africa's the yellow line, global is the dark line, and South Africa on the left is the red line. And you have an increase in organized crime across that period in South Africa. It's not the only country that's doing it, but I don't think it will surprise anybody in this audience that the assessment showed that. It's well above both the Africa and global rates. And for resilience, importantly, its resilience rates, so that's a good thing, are also much higher than the global rate and much higher than the African rate. So in summary, and you'll see it on the matrix, increasing organized criminality, comparatively high levels of resilience. What does that mean? Capacity to respond, state institutional capacity, civil society capacity, independent media, and the like are able to respond. I'll say one thing now, which is important, is that the index has historically shown that democracies are more resilient to organized crime. And indeed, that emerges also through some of the data here. Not immediately, not in the short term, but in the longer term, medium to longer term. Now, I guess this is what has been quoted in the media, and that is that South Africa is in the top 15 countries for organized crime globally. That's a combination of criminality, so the market score plus the actor score. One very important point to make about where South Africa sits is that there's a natural weighting in the index to countries with multiple markets. Now, that seems obvious, but it's really an important point. We don't weight each market differently. And so if you have organized criminality in all 15 markets or in the majority of them, your overall average is higher. So countries with a lot of resources, positioned, etc., Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, the DRC, etc., perform badly because of that. So that doesn't mean that the weighting is hiding anything. It's just an important point to say that organized crime in countries at the top end of the index are those with a very large diversity of criminal markets, and that's true for South Africa. So country number one is Myanmar, in conflict, enormous amounts of resources, very high levels of criminality. Colombia, watch Colombia here because I'm going to come back to it in its comparison to South Africa, Mexico, Paraguay, Ecuador, DRC, South Africa. Minister Kachalia for example, quoted, I think in News 24, saying South Africa has to worry about moving upwards into these top 7, and he's right. I think there's good arguments to say that South Africa really does have high levels of organized criminality. It's followed by Nigeria, Lebanon, Turkey, Kenya, Iraq, Honduras, Brazil. I'll come back to that, and then a number of other countries. Now, that's just the criminality score. Where does Southern Africa fit? Because it's actually an important point. And if you look at Central America, where we as an institution do a lot of work in South Asia and in West Asia, are regions globally that have the highest level of criminality. Southern Africa, the region we're in now, actually falls below the global average. So the point to make is that South Africa is a comparative outlier in the region with high levels of criminality. If you put the South African score here, it would be right on the left-hand side. The region in Africa with the highest level of total criminality is the East African region. And there's more consistency across the region in levels of criminality. We launched the ENACT index in Nairobi last week, and appropriately so, because that's the region that's most badly affected. Now, if we take the matrix, I showed you the boxes with numbers of countries, and apply the regional study to that, you get a sense of where South Africa sits. South Africa is in the 9 unique number of countries which have very high criminality, but also high resilience. It's just above the bar, so you can see where South Africa sits. No regional groups sit there, only countries. And you can see the total for South America is just below in the red, Central and Eastern Europe, Central America, East Africa, Northern Western Europe are in the green box, Central Asia, the Caribbean, and others are in low criminality, low resilience. So South Africa has this very interesting position in the vulnerability matrix. How does South Africa's level, so now I'm talking the criminal markets, compare to the Africa level and the global level? And I'll go through those just very, very briefly. On synthetic drug trade, South Africa is well above both global and regional. The same applies to extortion. You can see there's the second criminal category, followed by arms trafficking, also above, fauna, non-renewable, heroin, cyber-dependent, cocaine, financial crimes, etc. So this is the criminal markets in South Africa. The red cross is the increase since 2023. Only human trafficking, to some degree, cannabis and human smuggling, does South Africa fall below the global and African averages. And of course, this is the reason why it's in the top 15 countries globally. What has increased since 2019 to 25 in the index? The cocaine trade has grown quite rapidly as measured in South Africa, followed by flora, slightly by cannabis, synthetic drugs. Human smuggling has gone up, as has human trafficking, and then smaller increases in a range of crimes. But 9 out of 10 of the original markets that we began to measure have grown over the period in which we have conducted the index. And resilience has remained largely stable. I'm not quoting the numbers because there's a lot of them, and I want to draw out the key trends. Resilience has increased slightly, but it's broadly, because the number is relatively low, a stable reading. Now, criminal actors, we are measuring the 5 criminal actors, quite a complicated process, and we really gather a lot of information. In the next round of the index, we will focus much more on actors, so we have the resources to focus in a great deal of details on the actors. Mafia-style groups have grown, so that's significant in the South African context, well above global and African averages. So have criminal networks. So have state-embedded actors, and it's an issue I want to come to because state-embedded actors in the South African context are very important to protecting and driving criminal markets, followed by foreign actors, and then private sector actors. And mafia-style groups and private sector actors have shown an increase over the period in which we've done the assessment. In terms of resilience, South Africa is, again, and this is the defining point about the country, its resilience is higher than both the global and African averages. So you can see across all of these points, there was a slight decline. It's measuring 2024 in anti-money laundering and an improvement in international cooperation. And generally, it has stayed the same. It is below the global average on law enforcement, below on prevention, and below on victim and witness support. Prevention and victim and witness support includes whistleblowers, and I'm going to come back to those 2 categories in terms of what the data says about making changes in South Africa. So those are the resilience measures. Now, if you look at the 9 countries that are in the top right-hand corner, so starting to turn to where South Africa may be comparable to, you can see South Africa is ringed in red, and there's a number of other countries in and around that cluster which are important. So Malaysia, Costa Rica has moved quite rapidly into this space. A number of European countries, high resilience, high organized crime. And then underneath South Africa is Colombia, Nigeria, Kenya, and Brazil. So this clustering of countries with relatively strong states, but also high levels of organized crime. This is just a slide showing the same thing, but in the context of the global score. So the average for the globe is the green triangle. The average for Africa is the red triangle. And again, these are only African countries. And you can see some African countries, Cape Verde, Senegal, are actually in the green square. But the remainder are either in low resilience, low organized crime, or in high criminality, low resilience square. So what country could we compare ourselves to? And actually, it's very challenging to do this. And you would say, well, the country or countries that we could compare ourselves to would have similar population size. They would have similar levels of inequality, arguably a big driver of organized crime, and similar levels of GDP. And I have to say that South Africa is pretty unique. There's hardly any countries broadly within that band. You can see the ones that come close: Thailand, Vietnam, Colombia is in fact the closest, and South Africa. And so Colombia has a very different criminality profile, lower resilience, higher levels of organized crime. But in terms of inequality, population size, and inequality, GDP, it's relatively similar. So if you look at the comparison between South Africa and Colombia, I won't stick on this because it's a bit too much detail beyond what I want to say. But the overall point, you can see South Africa has greater capacity, greater institutional capacity, and slightly less levels of crime. It's a bit of an unfair comparison, and South Africa's in a better place, partly because Colombia is so dominated by the cocaine trade. So I want to state that absolutely clearly up front. And that means, and that's the point I want to make, coming to the next slide, that South Africa has greater capacity to respond, actually to increase its resilience and reduce its crime. So you can see that there. I can't resist putting Brazil up because people are always saying, how do we compare to Brazil? The bottom line is that Brazil's a much bigger country, much higher levels of GDP, much higher level of population, and it has a criminality that varies across the country, and you can see the differences between South Africa and Brazil. Again, very similar to higher levels of resilience here and higher levels of organized crime, or slightly lower levels of organized crime. So that's the overarching picture. It doesn't look good, but I do want to say that there is some important signs overall, and I want to turn to that and then hopefully have a discussion around it. We've been doing a lot of work because we have now a huge volume of data about what can we do or what should states do to move their country, so to speak. So in other words, how do you increase resilience and reduce organized crime? And what is, and that speaks, of course, to a relationship between resilience and organized crime. So I want to speak about what are the possibilities of moving South Africa left into the green. It's a serious question. It should be the question that everybody is asking. Now, the first point to say is that there's a very complicated relationship statistically between resilience, our resilience measures, and overall criminality. The closest and very best and very high correlation is between state-embedded actors and resilience. This is crucial for South Africa. So if you improve your resilience and reduce your state-embedded actors are elements within the state protecting organized crime broadly. That is a proxy for the overall reduction of crime. And this is key, and it emerges very clearly from the data. So state-embedded actors are a key obstacle to resilience. If you can reduce the role of state-embedded actors, you can reduce, the data shows you can reduce levels of criminality. Not all two resilience indicators, law enforcement and non-state actors. Non-state actors is not such a good description for our purposes. It means civil society, media, etc., are less connected to this. And we think that's because when state actors are powerful, law enforcement becomes captured, civil society becomes constrained. And we know from our own work globally that that's the case. But the bottom line is that you can create a positive dynamic by, in essence, attacking the state-embedded actor indicator. Now, what's important also when you look at the South African data is that the criminal component has been growing. So criminal actors in green. It's not great to put criminal actors in green, but it's an upward movement. Overall criminality, the red, and criminal markets. So that's the sort of summary with the overall criminality is the red bar, which you should be looking at. It's been increasing, as I've been saying, but the rate of increase has declined. Organized crime is stabilizing in South Africa at a very, very high level. That's what the data suggests. It's not declining rapidly. It's I think the simplest point is to say the rate of its increase is slowing, and that's good news. And it suggests it's a very important period to do something about it. It's very hard to know exactly why that is the case, but there's lots of reasons that you could put forward, but this is what the data shows. So what should we do? Now, this is quite a complicated statistical model, and I don't want to spend too much time explaining it because there's some bigger policy options that emerge from it. If you have limited resources as a government, you want to know where to invest them to bring down organized crime. So it's a key question. We are told often in every country, and of course the same applies to South Africa, well, we don't have enough money to invest to respond. So we need to make choices. We need to invest in some things and not in others. And the resilience data says the global resilience data set says that you can improve your resilience by focusing on those indicators which are at the lowest level, and then you experience diminishing returns. So it's an important point. If you are already investing a lot, more investment doesn't bring you more reductions. If you invest in things that are very low, you have rapid initial reductions, and then it slows. It's quite a complicated a mathematical model, but the point is clear that you need to choose a narrow set, invest heavily, you will achieve progress, and then that progress will decline. So now what does that say for South Africa? The two lowest indicators in the South African resilience bucket is witness protection, victim protection, whistleblower protection. So that on the model suggests that's where money should be invested. Second point is prevention. Now, there's a lot that we can say about prevention. Janini's here, in fact, we had a national crime prevention strategy, which did a lot of crime reduction in the period from 1994, probably the most rapid reduction rate in a homicide rate ever in South Africa. Partly because of, and you can argue, was it always successful? But part of that was a really strong focus on prevention, partnerships, building greater resilience. If you invest, and this is the first slide, and the first slide is a measure of not so much money, right? So this is a slide where where you take more money, but it's not so much. And you invest in two over a long period of time, and broadly, you start to swap out and invest in other issues later on. So from around 2040, 2042, and I'll show you what the model looks like. This is the model where you have much more money. The Treasury says you can have much more money. So you start investing in the shorter term in witness victim protection, in prevention, and you invest until 2032, and then you swap into others. And you change and you swap into others. So with the law of diminishing returns, when you invest, you achieve reductions, and then you invest in other of the resilience indicators. And what does the statistical model show? And of course, this is a statistical model. There's lots of things that happen in the world outside of that. But you can see in scenario one, where you have less money and you invest in only the two over a longer time, you achieve a sustained reduction to around 6.5. That does not move you into the green, but it moves you. So that's important. And by 2050, South Africa would be in a quantumly different position, dropping 2 points in the index. If you take scenario two, which is more investment in witness protection and the like, this category, plus prevention, and then swapping out and using investment at a higher level into other indicators, South Africa could move into the green by 2046 on the statistical model. I want to emphasize that it's the statistical model that suggests that, and we know that reality can be somewhat different. But the good news is that there are points of leverage based on a huge data set. This is points of leverage from what we know around the world that is being done by countries. And so in many ways, that's good news, but it has to be strategically done with leadership and with investment. This is the last slide, I promise. What are the key takeaways from the South African discussion? First, South Africa is in a unique position globally. It's one of 9 countries with high crime and high resilience. It ranks 7th, so I've already said that. There's a highly diverse criminal landscape. It's had marginal improvements in resilience. It remains the 3rd highest from a resilience perspective in Africa. It's characterized by very high levels of violence. I showed you Colombia. South Africa's homicide rate is in the early 40s. Colombia's homicide rate is in the mid-20s. And it has, as an aggravating factor that drives criminality. I didn't want to focus too much on violence. There's some interesting slides to talk about around that. Final point is, by targeting key areas of resilience, you can bring down areas of organized crime, and that's got to be good news for South Africa. Last point to make, why do we do all of this? The point is that there is not enough data or statistical knowledge around the issue of organized crime in criminal markets. Is it perfect? No. But it provides, if you like, the first sets of certainty around what countries can do to take on some of the key challenges of our time. So thank you very much, Ottilia.
Thank you, Mark. By no measure a difficult task, the research process itself, but then being able to present it in ways that I think most, if not all people can understand. Colleagues, we have about 59 people online, and then we have about 30 of you in the room, which means we'll try to balance inputs both virtually and in the room in terms of engagement. The good news is we have quite a lot of time in order for us to do that. So please, this is very much a discussion as much as it is an interrogation of the index as well. So ask questions, but also we're really interested in hearing your insights. There are a number of experts in the room, either people that have worked on the policies around violence prevention, people from policing and criminal justice sector, as well as those from the non-governmental and government space. So please do raise your hands, both online and in the room, and then I'll give you the floor to provide your input. But while people warm up to asking their questions and making their comments, you've centered the state in the building resilience component. But as you rightly point out right at the end, there is so much that can intervene, whether in the positive or in the negative. Here in South Africa, we've seen that the role, particularly of non-governmental organizations, almost as, not always as whistleblowers, but also as watchdogs, or even a state function, has allowed some degree of accountability. But also in many ways, when you look at the Human Sciences Research Council's perceptions of both violence, criminality, and response feedback, you also see a society that wants to invest in reducing crime, reducing violence, but is perhaps not enabled to do so. So when we talk about building resilience, we're not just talking about building institutional resilience, right? We're also talking about community level resilience. So we'd be very interested to hear from you, Mark, the role that society can play to accelerate what you've just pointed out in your penultimate slide there. So beyond the state, what can we do? And then I'll turn to the room. Please do raise your hand so I can acknowledge you. And by room, I also mean those that are online as well. Yes, please go ahead while people raise their hands or gather their thoughts.
I think there's two components to civil society which is worth talking about. The first is civil society as a red flag and information gatherer and presenter. We as an initiative are supporting around 300 civil society initiatives globally. So an enormous number of people working against organized crime in their communities. These are not vigilante groups. These are often leaders who, because of the breakdown of the state or the criminalization of the state, are standing up to respond to their communities. A very good example is the mothers of the disappeared in Mexico. These are mothers who go out, they collect the remains of their children, and in our view, that is an important contributing factor to building resilience in. Having done this now for a long time, though, those people are often in great danger. So the point about resilience is to make sure that civil society actors like that are connected to initiatives within the state. And I don't say that lightly, and it's a challenging role for me running the GI is the security of the people that we support. The issue that I think is important, however, is that civil society actors a broader space media is particularly important when the state doesn't necessarily do its job or becomes criminalized or corrupted. What the data does show is that civil society actors lose their ability to engage when the state becomes very criminalized. And that makes sense. Because the state cracks down on civil society actors, and that's the truth in many countries around the world. So to say that in a country like South Africa, civil society actors, the media, the ability for open debate, given what's already obviously happening in the news here, is crucial. And it feeds into this idea of democratic resilience to organized crime. What we have seen, before I move to the next part of what I want to say about civil society, is that in more authoritarian states, what happens is that the state takes over criminal markets. So when you have high levels of state embedded actors managing, protecting criminal markets, as the state becomes more authoritarian, the state, in fact, uses criminal markets to takes rents from them, uses it for patronage networks and the like. Again, to emphasize how important this dynamic is. On the second side of what you're saying, I think the role of in the organized crime discussion, because a lot of the discussion, not incorrectly in South Africa, is about improving law enforcement and making independent law enforcement. And I think that is important. Independent specialist law enforcement, free of political interference. There's no doubt that that's a crucial intervention. But you cannot arrest your way out of this problem. You have to engage in serious levels of prevention. And that's what the data shows. And even I had my doubts until you see the data. Unless you also engage in serious levels of prevention, which means changing laws, investing in people, it's targeting vulnerable young men, all the plethora of things we know in a highly unequal society, we will not be able to move the needle alone. And so what does that mean? It means doing what South Africans, and I speak as a South African, although I run a global organization, it means doing what South Africans do best, which is to get together, consolidate a plan, build a strategy, and get different elements in the society working together to reduce organized crime. We have serious challenges with policing. I think, and that's why I showed the slide of the tailing off of organized crime. Here's the opportunity in the ongoing processes to begin improving, strengthening, reforming policing. But we need, based on this data, to strengthen also our preventative civil society and other engagements in responding to organized crime.
Thank you. I'm looking to colleagues in the room. We do have one question already from Amar Singh Bandal from the University of Cambridge that I will read in a moment. But we'll like to pull about 2-3 questions in each round so that if some of those are interconnected, that Mark can be able to respond to them. Karen, please go ahead, and then the gentleman in front of you and you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Karen Abraham, Cycle Foundation. Hi.
Hi.
An understanding question to start with. You are speaking about the money laundering and the strengthening criminal justice system. And on the resilience capacities, the money laundering sits actually above the law enforcement, even though it's declining capacity, but it sits well above to the left of it.
Yeah.
Whereas on your investment scenarios, both in 1 and 2, you're prioritizing that over strengthening the law enforcement. I'm wondering why. And number 2, you're speaking about tailing off organized crime, and the slide is named in a similar way. But if I understand you correctly, it's actually not tailing off, it's just that its growth rate is declining.
Yes.
So, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then Amar Singh Bandal from the University of Cambridge is asking if you've seen examples of other states implementing investment models in resilience building, like the one that you propose for South Africa. And then a third question, please go ahead.
For many years, I think South Africa's law enforcement, government, et cetera, has actually been overwhelmed by crime. And the government has started putting together commissions. It's ongoing. It never stops. And it sort of builds resilience in a smaller way. People eventually are provided with some sort of hope. But then these commissions finish. And do what's being perceived, and I'm going to say that, as lack of political will, nothing really happens after that. People are being exposed, like the Madlanga Commission at the moment. There's a lot of people being exposed, and people are still hoping. But in the end, if nothing happens and there's no government will to actually do anything about it, is that not going to let the actual resilience go down completely as far as the communities is concerned? Because as a community, what do we do then to force the government to actually do something about it?
Thank you. He references the Madlanga Commission, which is the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into alleged criminality, political interference, and corruption in the criminal justice system. Fourth hand, please go ahead.
Yes, Fitriana Nur, IOM. So it's interesting to see the resilience model. We've been investing, collecting evidence using the roots-based approach. We've been producing like migrant mixed movement, what happens to them along the southern routes. And it's very interesting when you said that witness protection, victim protection, and whistleblowers are samples of institutional strengthening that we could use as a model. But to be quite frank, the countries along the routes are not having the same standard as South Africa. So I wonder if maybe the next iteration of the report to look at the routes as a modeling to see. I mean, I see Indonesia there. We've been assisting victims of South African victims for forced criminality. It'd be interesting to look at what like these resilience indicators in those countries where South Africans are trafficked to, and see if those institutional models are harmonized enough so that we could at least prevent and respond to the crimes.
Thank you so much. I have noted additional hands in the room as well as in the chat. Mark, quite a number of issues. I think for the next round, we will limit each round to about two or three. There is a lot of time for that, so don't feel that we won't get to you. We certainly will. But the issues raised are if you identify money laundering, for example, as a key area, why not in the interventions? And then in terms of investment models, the investment model that you propose for South Africa, is this something that is already happening elsewhere in the world that perhaps we can learn lessons from? And then, of course, the importance of commissions of inquiry, such as those looking into allegations of corruption, particularly in the criminal justice system, build trust, but if nothing follows after, what then? And then beyond national level interventions for South Africa alone, recognizing that organized crime is trans-border in nature, what can countries along specific routes, so not only the southern route, but anywhere else, be able to work together to actually respond? So this is more a national response, but then also a regional response question. And then I've noted 2 hands in the room, and there's 2 questions already in the chat. Multiple hands are coming up. We'll get to in a moment. Mark, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. I'll start at the bottom and then move up. On the resilience, so colleague from IOM, on the resilience indicators around victim and witness protection along the routes, yes, South Africa has higher levels, but very, very few countries have high levels in this particular resilience category. So what I'm saying for South Africa applies also to other countries along the route. And of course, I know your concern is human trafficking, but what the data is focused on is witness support more generally and victim support more generally. So the issue of supporting witnesses across the South African criminal justice system, but particularly in high-level organized crime cases, and investing in that. So I know there's a connection with the area that you work. What the data shows, and I'm very careful to say that, right? What the data shows, if there was investment in that, we could begin the tracking down. And what the data shows again, and it comes to Karen's question, which is a very good one. The question any state has to make is, do I invest more in law enforcement, or do I invest more in A, B, or C? What a good policy model is saying is, here's quite a specific thing where you can invest, which can bring about reductions from what we know in a statistical model. So I think the question is a very good one. It takes an enormous amount of data processing I did this specifically for South Africa, but obviously I was presenting here, but you can do this for other countries along the route as well, where investment should be. On the commissions, I utterly take the point that we have a measure of political will in the index, which takes an enormous amount of research and discussion in terms of labeling it. I think the commissions are a standout example, and there are not so many cases like this globally of a state. I really need to say this. I know it's easy to get depressed in South Africa. Of a state that puts all of its dirty washing on the table. It's an unbelievably important mechanism of oversight over law enforcement, because it's about how democracies respond. Again, the point of democratic strength in resilience. At the same time, it changes the debate, and is changing the debate about how we respond to organized crime. And it points to and undermines state-embedded actors, both within the police, which is a key point, not only in South Africa generally, and also within political structures. So I think the commissions, the Moderator Commission, and of course the Parliamentary Commission, operating in parallel, are a game changer, or just or maybe to be in line with what you're saying, could be a game changer. Could be a game changer. And they could be a game changer because out of them, and it's early days, provides the possibility for strengthened, independent resource law enforcement responding to the issue of organized crime. Related to that, we did a threat assessment of organized crime in South Africa. Some of you may remember 2 to 3 years ago. I forget the exact date. South Africa, for a long time, did not see itself as having an organized crime problem, literally. It did not define itself as having an organized crime problem. That has fundamentally changed. And the narrative around that has changed. Nobody questions that the country has an organized crime threat, and that's the correct interpretation. So all of this building together means that hopefully the response is also building. The point I want to make about the commissions is that independent law enforcement, well-led, without political interference, can make a fundamental difference to organized crime. It's clear. But it cannot do it alone. So if we want to move into the green box, you've got to prevent people being drawn into organized crime, and you've got to reduce the incentives. And you've got to work together to be able to do that. And that model, literally, I mean, it would be astonishing for South Africa to move into that green box. And the message from the data is it's possible. It's literally possible. It will take some time, but investments, if the model is correct, will pay dividends. Karen, just back to your question, which is an important one. I don't want to overcomplicate the discussion. What is invested in is built on a wider global model. So investment in anti-money laundering in particular periods helps. And this is broadly what the model suggests. The law of diminishing returns is important here. South Africa spends a fair amount on law enforcement in total. You can question where that money is invested in the law enforcement package. But the law of diminishing returns is the more you spend, the less you get. And that's the important point to draw from the model. So spend and focus in areas where you're very low and you will get higher returns. Again, it's a mathematical model coming from a huge data set. And that's the point that I'm trying to make, but it also makes sense. I think there's an argument that says it's a sustainable point to make. On examples, the question from the colleague in Cambridge, I have to say the example question is really hard because we have lots of micro level examples, including ones we are funding, but not near enough macro level examples of prevention. South Africa came close in its relatively strong reduction of homicide levels, I think around 70 per 100,000 in 1994 down into the 30s. The model that is often used, and I was there recently, is a very good model. It's Japan. Japan had a concerted, targeted effort against organized crime, but it had a set of structural conditions, a highly resourced state, and a changing socio-political context. So all of these things count. But South Africa can have the same level of issues. And what the Japanese did was essentially made crime less attractive for the Yakuza and made it much less cool to be in organized crime. And I think there needs to be some thinking around that in the South African context, in the prevention models that we build. Again, I'm not saying don't invest in law enforcement or law enforcement is not important. The commissions are key platforms for doing that, but we need better thinking according to the model around the prevention function. Have I missed anything? No,
you haven't. So we have a hand from Balulekile Mlaba. Please, if you can switch on your microphone and make your comment or pose your question.
Good day, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you so much for this presence. My question is that given how deeply rooted churches and other faith-based organizations are in many South African communities, how should we think about their role in national crime reduction efforts? Is there a constructive way for the state to engage with these institutions without blurring the lines between community partnership and the separation of church and the state?
Thank you very much, Balulekile. And then we've got a hand right at the back, and then we'll have one more in the room before we come back to Mark and Extra. Please go ahead.
Hi, okay, thanks, David, please, consultant for the ISS. Mark, I just, as I've been thinking about it since I first put up my head, my question is getting more and more kind of complicated, but basically,
it's ominous, dude.
So I'll keep it at the simple level. So now, because it seems to me that support to victims and support to witnesses and whistleblowers are not necessarily all the same thing.
No.
And it potentially varies quite a lot with markets, but also that support to victims can be a kind of type of preventive measure. But it also can be something or support to witnesses and whistleblowers is in some ways a way of enabling and facilitating the criminal justice system. So, you know, to make use of that asset more effectively. So I'm just wondering, you know, but the other thing is just that the kind of default where people talk about witness support and protection, particularly, is this idea of these kind of residential programs. And the general picture is that witnesses do not want to go onto those kind of residential programs. So I just wanted to, you know, if South Africa was to invest in, you know, what are you thinking of when you think about expanding investment in this? What would that investment look like?
Thanks a lot. And then one more in the room here. I have noted the other hand, so we'll come to you in a moment. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much. My name is Frances Craigie. I'm from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. What I'm struggling a little bit with, and maybe it's because you have 4,000 indicators,
Yes.
I just want to understand maybe a little bit about how the international demand issues are built into the index. So, there's obviously organized crime happening within South Africa, and we can almost say it's a South African issue. But then there's a lot of commodities that enter the illicit market, and that is because of a demand coming from other countries. So I was just wondering, in terms of the criminality index as well as the resilience issues, how you kind of deal with those international issues. And there's quite a lot of work that we're trying to do now at an international level to strengthen the Transnational Organized Crime Convention. And is it worthwhile spending time on those things, given the time we have, the resources we have? Or do you think rather we should be spending more time in South Africa? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Mark, to you. And then I have noted 2 hands in the room, and then also Tokozisi and Judith online. Please, if you are interested in providing input, just remember to raise your hand.
Francis, again, I'll start at the bottom. The questions are very good. It's challenging to answer these questions, I have to say, and I thank you for asking them. And I don't say that as a get out of jail card. I just say that, okay? This is a hugely complicated area. What we hope the index does, this massive investment in data collection, is change the debate, which is often not very data driven. And criminal justice statistics everywhere, not only in South Africa, simply don't provide a helpful window into what is occurring in the wider illicit market sphere. On the environment, I think the first point to make is that when we started to design the index, when the initiative was founded, we tried at first to do market and flow models, but it was too challenging. We've come back to that now. So we've built a state-based index. And one reason to do that is, of course, that from your very first question, Ottilia, is that states are a point of policy engagement for us. And as I've been trying to make the argument, that policy engagement is trying to tell people what they can do institutionally and how they can manage to reduce levels of crime and improve public safety. So you can look at flow models in the index, and you can do that sort of through geographic mapping, etc., but it's not perfect. We are now doing 2 things, which I hope in the next round, which would help answer the question that you have asked. Firstly, we are doing much more collection on criminal groups. So who they are and where they are, and mapping that onto the platform. That's an enormous amount of work, and it means doing a lot of research in individual countries to take account of the demand issue. And one of the reasons that we've done that is on this round of the index, foreign actors have grown exponentially. So what's occurring in global organized crime is that foreign criminal actors are present in much more states, including South Africa. Now, I make that point carefully because you don't want to have a xenophobic response to that. But the point is that as the world has globalized and internationalized over the last couple of decades, criminal networks have spread and are well ensconced in multiple countries. And we're talking about a global criminal economy, which is just different from anything we've ever had. So what you're saying calls strongly, I think, for both better policy work, what we do, but also better responses around flows. On UNTOC, the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, we institutionally, and I've spent a long time in UNODC, we institutionally, as the global initiative, are critical. And why are we critical? And then I'll come to the 4th protocol, because I think that's where you're going. We are critical not because we don't like the convention. We think the convention is a very, very important blueprint for responding to organized crime. But the first point is that it was an immediate response to a organized crime crisis in the mid-1990s. The killing of two Italian magistrates, very focused on a number of, on a less globalized organized crime world. And so we think there's arguments or ways in which the convention can be improved. Secondly, what we know and what research work shows very clearly is that conventions without teeth are very weak. And this convention has a very weak review mechanism. And hardly, I forget the exact number, but it's a handful of countries that have gone and had an effective review process through the convention. It's achingly slow. And thirdly, independent voices have been restricted. So it's very state-based. There's hardly any coverage of it in the media, yet it's a key global blueprint and convention. Does that mean that we shouldn't do a fourth protocol on your area in the wildlife area? No. I have come to believe that the fourth protocol is necessary because the sooner that we have a global legal framework to respond, the better. But we also need greater leadership and investment in the convention as a whole. So our approach is to say yes to the fourth protocol, but also to push the UN system to have a better vision around the convention itself. And I think that is the critical two set that we need. We need better international cooperation around these issues. That's an old drumbeat in this debate. Everyone says it, but it doesn't often get done, and it's very complicated. I do want to say that the global ecosystem of information around criminal markets is changing, and the global law enforcement ecosystem is changing. And that's because there's much more actors producing information and putting it into that. That's the private sector. It's institutions like us, and it's others. So it's more likely to see it as a triangle, the multilateral system, Interpol, and then independent actors committed to making a change. That's a fundamental difference to what we had 2 decades ago. So there's a rolling change in the system. It's very, very different than it was before.
Mark, sorry, before you respond to the other two issues connected to this point, Charles Goredema is asking the extent to which supranational mechanisms can enhance resilience in South Africa, the region in which it is located, or other countries. And here he's talking specifically around conventions, protocols, and treaties at a regional, but also a global level. You've spoken to UNCHOC and the fourth protocol, but also around agencies that have the capacity to name and shame or penalize lack of compliance. So this is piggybacking on this point so that we, when we come back to this issue, you don't have to repeat what you're saying, but there are still questions pending, both from David and Balukile. So please.
Thanks, Charles, to throw in a difficult question. I'll answer it quickly. I think where there are teeth, the FATF, and you can criticize the FATF. South Africa moved quite fast and coherently and impressively to get off the grey list. So that suggests there's important leverage there. But it must not just be a box ticking exercise, I think. And so let's say international cooperation, solidarity around these issues is absolutely key to respond to Charles's point. I think naming and shaming applies, and I guess the index sort of does that, but our point is about engagement with data. Related to that is the naming and shaming of individuals by civil society and others, and that's also a powerful tool. In most places where I am traveling or working, or people know who the main criminals are, but they are largely untouchable very often. So it means that naming and shaming in a global environment, there's a debate about how much impact this has. Do people just brush it off? I don't think so. I think when you do that, banks log those people's names. It's harder for them to travel, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this parallel process, which Charles hasn't asked, which is my third leg of the triangle, where people are actively engaged in doing that. There's a big cost there, though, and that is, I give you an example. I won't name the country. Somebody who does that in a country where we work has just been picked up, kidnapped for 4 days, beaten up and released. We help them to leave the country. That's because they challenge prevailing criminal protection systems. And there needs to be more support around exactly those people. To some degree, they are whistleblowers and others, in responding to global criminal markets and the protective structures around them. I come back to David's very complicated question. It's a very good question, David. I think I don't have all the answers on this, and the data that we prepared for this presentation is really new, right? So I think what witness and victim protection does, and you allude to this in your answer, is that, well, witness protection is essential. I mean, the details are of course important, but what the data shows is if you can protect witnesses, you can improve the criminal justice system. It's kind of obvious. And in organized crime cases around the world, people won't testify or are regularly threatened or killed, including in South Africa. And so protecting that bolsters the rule of law. And I think this is the important point that I want to get to, is that witness and victim protection are about bolstering the confidence in the institutions of criminal justice. And I think that's why it has an impact. And Graham is here. We are working on a project putting lawyers in police stations. Why do I think that's important? Because it's improving democratic policing. It's improving the collection of evidence and data, presenting it, pushing it, and showing that the rule of law functions. And I think witness, victim, whistleblower protection, I think it's a lot clumped into one, but it's fundamentally about protecting ordinary people in their engagement with the state. Now, it's very hard from the data to sort of draw out all the threads of that, but I think there's a strong argument to be made why that's such an important investment. Generally, victims of organized crime in South Africa and elsewhere feel isolated and rejected from the state. In fact, the state's very far from them. The state is often a corrupt local police officer or whatever the case might be. If the state is intervening, protecting across a range of criminality or forms of criminality, perhaps that is what the data is suggesting. Where that investment has occurred elsewhere, greater legitimacy is built into the system. So I really support, I think, the conclusions that you drew as your question became more complicated, if you understand what I mean. And I think there's some value in that. And when I saw that in the data, because I've been a skeptic sometimes on some of the preventative and other issues, I was really actually shocked, because it means that you can invest in one thing which we know broadly how to do, and that may have implications. On churches, well, the only point to say is I think churches, social organizations, in all of the experiences of crime prevention, are key partners. And there's lots to say about the role of these kinds of organizations, but partnering with, not dominated by the state, is important ways in which broader resilience is built. In my view, the state has to provide leadership for resilience, either through a strategic approach, drawing in partners, investing in people who do resilience, targeting the correct groups, and important changes can be made. One point that I really do want to say is that the prevention around violence, which I haven't spoken about because I wanted to keep the presentation relatively short, in the South African context is crucial. I mentioned 2 homicide rates, Colombia, which when you compare South Africa to Colombia in organized crime, people are, oh my God, we compare to Colombia. I mean, frankly, our homicide rate is much more serious than Colombia. So, and the exact question of what proportion of our homicides are linked to organized crime, I think is an open question. But the general focus on violence reduction in what we do has to be key.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Over to you. And then we've got Thokozisi online, one hand here in front, and then we'll go to a next round. I have noted your hand. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Charles Vnikak. I work for Transnet in group security. First of all, just thank you for doing a quantitative analysis of organized crime. It's rare. Police often tend towards qualitative research because it's maths. You did the organization, GTOC, did a very good report and a useful report on the illicit copper market in South Africa by Jenny Arish-Koshebane. Unfortunately, she has passed away. But my question, there's much work that can be done in that area. We don't really have a global understanding of infrastructure crime in the context of the theft of copper. And I was wondering whether you would consider this as a category in future indexes. Suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then Thokozisi, please, if you can switch on your microphone and make your comment or pose your question.
Morning. Thank you very much for the presentation and the insights. Just 2 points from me, primarily exploratory. So I don't know if you have insights into the life cycles of the respective actors within this ecosystem. And I'm asking this because it would appear to me that what essentially we are talking about here is disrupting this ecosystem or an industry. And I'm applying this sort of, let's call it a commercial or a business lens intentionally, just to kind of, to have this make sense to me. And when we talk disruption, we are most often looking at things other than traditional measures, right? This is how you disrupt industries. You plug in something new that, will cause a frenzy or a chaos, so to speak, or an adjustment, right? And this is not to discredit all these other measures which have been mentioned, but it's just, let's have another lens. Now that I've sort of contextualized that and defined that, for me it makes sense. And you did allude to this when you talked about market inflows, but I think you were talking about it specific to sort of international supply chains, right? But if we're looking at life cycle of the participants and the individuals, right? And we're looking at the life cycles of the subsectors, right? Is there insight into this? Is there an understanding therein the ability or the appreciation of where precise, meaningful action can be effected? And I'll take this right back to the matter of resilience, right? Is we acknowledge that there is a resilience. We don't know what the source of the resilience is. In effect, that resilience could run out tomorrow, and we are exposed. So, so I suppose then we kind of need to know, what we need to profile this resilience and know what is enabling and what is deterring action in respect to that. Okay, so that's the first point. And then the second point is if there is sort of a review of the report structures and frameworks. So you've presented something today. Has it been considered against the last of these? And what came to mind when I was thinking about this is just like a lay hypothetical example. It's sort of most recently in South Africa that consumption of marijuana has been decriminalized. And so one would assume then or expect that criminal activity or organized crime activity around this sector has reduced as a consequence of the sector by itself being decriminalized, if that makes sense. And so when we are doing the activities or the report generation activities, how are we reviewing ourselves? And I'm saying we, this is generic, but then how are we reviewing ourselves? How are we saying, well, last time we did this, this was, marijuana was a criminal activity. This time we're doing it, it's not. So this is just a matter of methodology, I suppose, more than anything. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Thokozisi Meiwa. And then Janine, please comment or question.
Thanks. A comment first, Mark, to say I'm so impressed by this version of the index, to see the maturation of it. I think it's a quantum leap, and it really becomes extremely helpful for us in particular. So well done to everyone for that work. I had 2 points. One you just picked up on, which was about the extreme violent nature of South African organized crime. And it made me think about firearms and your own work on firearms and the central place of state-embedded actors, because what's very clear, I think becoming more clear in the South African story around the illicit economy in firearms is the role of state actors in providing supply. And also the other thing which has recently become more clear, I think, is the extremely problematic role of the private security industry in that illicit economy. And so I just wanted to hear your thoughts on, because for me, as resilience, as the area of prevention, we talk about violence prevention, tackling firearms in South Africa is an obvious way to reduce levels of mortality and lethality associated with organized crime. And I think that seems blindingly obvious, but it's not commonly prioritized. And then that private security thing leads me to the second question, which is about, you have judicial system as a piece of, as an option in resilience building, shall I say. And I think we're at quite an important point in South Africa where the debates are becoming more overt about privatizing criminal justice rather than reforming the state, investing in strengthening state criminal justice. A lot of money going into private security, private investigation, private intelligence, private forensics. And I just want what's your thoughts on that, and where else that trend is evident, and what the other experiences are of privatizing against organized crime in particular. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. So a collection of those questions, Mark, everything from the issues around copper theft in particular, looking at it not only from a logistics or transport point of view, but general security, to a philosophical question around the life cycles of actors in organized crime, in the organized crime ecosystem, and what, in the process of putting together reports such as this, adaptations are made to the methodology, any comparisons where policies change or practices change that influence that. And then with gratitude to Janine around the maturation of the index, which perhaps also responds to this methodology question as well, for those that may not have seen previous versions of the index in past years. And then perhaps two related but pointed questions around violence, firearms, state-embedded actors, and then the private security industry and space, both within the scope of violence and firearms, but then also how much of outsourcing the criminal justice system, I think, is the fundamental question Janine is asking. How much of outsourcing the criminal justice system is good for us or can actually impact our ability even to build resilience?
Thanks, Ottilia, and thank you for the questions. They are genuinely excellent. Again, I give it a bash. Charles, thank you very much. Can I just say that this is an area that is more cutting edge than people think. I think the debate is often about, well, we have organized crime and we need to respond. The point I want to make is that there have been, and there are underway, enormous changes in the global criminal economy. And we need better data and better research, and there needs to be partnership between states and people doing this work. One point about the commissions is I've been distressed about the commentary on academia, etc. I think there's arguments to make around the importance of doing this work in a very changing environment, and we need to do things differently. And again, to emphasize the point, I mean, I was in Finland recently. We're having the discussion around criminal justice data and the sense that it doesn't provide a good enough, what the state provides is not a good picture of what's going on. And one of the reasons, and this is true in many developed countries, that crime levels are dropping, but people feel insecure. And one of the reasons for that, in my view, is that we're not capturing everything that makes them feel insecure. And so this is the point where we're at, I think, in this debate. Thank you for mentioning Jenny. She was a very, very important member of our team and worked on this index year after year, including what you see here. Copper is here, but not broken down. And I take the point that we could do that. I was at a meeting the last 2 or 3 days ago about critical minerals. I think there's a lot of work to do in the sector to trace flows, and it's the amount of work to be done is just enormous, right? What the index does, I appreciate the comments in the room, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg. So the non-renewables is the category where we have included it. What we have resources to do is to break down each of the categories in individual reports. We now have huge volumes of data, and so we can do more, and we will continue to publish that. And our objective is to stimulate debate. So what is the purpose of an index? I think that's really important, because there's indexes of happiness and there's index of sadness and whatever else. This is an index which attempts to measure the advance of the global criminal economy, its harms in domestic environments, and what can be done about it. Going back to Francis's question, next steps: build the flows, identify the actors, look through the flow points and hotspots. Some of those are quite controversial. Where does money go? Where do commodities go? And so this is not an unpolitical process as we move forward. On Nkosizwe's questions, which are really, thank you, which are really very, very good. I will try to deal with the two of them. Organized crime does have a life cycle. What the data suggests is that the earlier you disrupt it, the better. And that's a kind of obvious point, but this is genuinely quite clear in the work around organized crime, is that once it becomes a system which is in the sinews of both the state and society, I think you can see some of that in the Western Cape, it becomes extremely difficult to eradicate. The life cycles are both around individuals. So as people get older and they move out of the criminal market, or they die, or they are killed, so it is worth mapping in the way in which life cycles of organized crime works. But equally important in life cycles of organized crime are the commodity markets that drive them. So if you look at the history of organized crime in South Africa, the key role that Mandrax played. from the 1970s. And to understand the markets that have built state protection mechanisms, the role of the state often in protecting those for a variety of reasons is key to understanding life cycles. The point about life cycles that I think is important from policy, it's about timing of intervention. I genuinely think in the gang environment now in the Western Cape, we are reaching a point where there is a big opportunity to act. Partly because of the enormous number of people that are killed in that process, and the growing recognition by everybody that this can't continue. On supply chains, the question is very complicated, and clearly the questioner has thought about these things a lot, which is good. I don't think we fully understand. I know we have a resilience measure, but to be modest about it, I don't think we fully understand what resilience to organized crime is. What we do know is that it's not only law enforcement. What we do know is that it's societal, and what we do know is that it has historical antecedents. The reality in South Africa is that we are weak on the historical antecedents because we have structural factors that have encouraged the building of organized crime because of the delegitimization of the state in part, and because of the weakness and penetration of the state. We have to reverse those strategically if we are going to make an impact on organized crime. And when the police say that that they can't deal with the social underpinnings of crime, and we, and including me, are often critical of that, they're not wrong. But then we have to seriously go about doing that and investing in that. I sense the questioner really has thought about that, and there's much more to say around this idea of ecosystems, changing incentives. But then you have to understand the markets as a political economy ecosystem. And the reality is that law enforcement institutions don't do that. And so you need a better system of analyzing and lifting that information out and building it into your strategic process. Almost no state does that effectively. And that's the change that is required, because police officers investigate individual cases or individual organizations, sometimes using ecosystem approaches. But above that, we need to understand, as we have said in copper or whatever else, and that's where key partnerships are required. On Janine's question, thank you for the compliment on the index, Janine, which is very important for us to know, given how much effort goes into it. Firearms are there. I think, and it's not something I or lots of other people haven't said, but my frustration in the firearms debate in South Africa is that we have not properly acknowledged how many firearms have flowed out of the state. Those are our firearms. We bought them with taxpayers' money. We should get them back. And I sound mad because I have worked a lot in those areas and have written a book on it. I think the case, which everybody probably in the room knows about, of the sale of firearms into organized crime still constitutes one of the biggest crimes of post-apartheid South Africa. But we don't even know where that case is now. And so I understand the whole regulatory debate around firearms, but the first step has to be with the state. The leakage of firearms from evidence rooms, I think the state is taking it more seriously, but we have still a lot more to do. And I think that's an area that definitely is a way to reduce violence. I understand the debate, which is the immediate response is not all firearms come from the state. There's lots of others. Yes, I accept that. But the state has a primary responsibility to its citizens to keep control over the firearms that it confiscates, buys, and controls. On the private security industry, my view has changed, I have to say. I think the private security industry is needed as a partner. I used to have my doubts about that, like many other people. I don't think in the context in which we operate, we can afford to be precious about this. And I think the private security industry brings enormous skills, resourcing. It has different incentives to the state. But what do we require? And there are very good examples to do that. We require proper regulation of the private security industry, and we require effective coordination mechanisms with the state. And then we can function. And if we work together in partnership, our objective should be to increase people's safety. And if that requires doing things differently, well, then let's do it. Essentially, that's what I believe.
Thanks a lot, Mark. You have been talking for most of the past hour and a half. We are getting to near the end of this seminar, but not the end of the discussion for sure. And there are a number of hands still raised, both in the room and we are going to get to them. For our online audience, in a moment, there will be a pop-up on your screen that asks you to evaluate this event. Similar to Janine's positive review of the Organized Crime Index, we ask you please to be honest in your response, so that if we need to improve, we will do so. If we are doing a good job, we'll give ourselves pats on the back. But the best way to remove the pop-up from your screen is to answer the very few short questions. Now, Rose Sanderson says, taking a person to court with all the evidence of criminality and handing it over to the court can sometimes feel like a joke, given the lack of skills that we see. This process can take years if the dockets aren't lost. This affects the residents who try to see justice and often don't. And her question is, where can this be improved urgently in respect of the suggested resilience model? For her, she says, residents need to see hope. Then Colin Coleman has a question around budgeting for all of this. So it's one thing to say, these are the interventions that need to be in place, but how much should the state be making room in the budget allocations to invest in capacitating? Specifically, it refers to the National Prosecuting Authority, as well as other institutions that are enforcing the rule of law. And then we have a question right at the back. You've raised your hand. Please go ahead.
Good morning. Speaking. As part of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, so I come from that perspective in terms of how we've looked at strategically addressing a number of systemic issues. There are 2 points that I'd like to just pick up on, and one is dealing with the data issues, and the other one is dealing with our countering approaches, dealing with crime. So with regards to data, there used to be a process which was called the Organised Crime Threat Analysis process that was run within the crime intelligence environment, and which in places like the UK, they run a serious organised crime threat analysis on quite a regular basis, where the state then also provides an outward-looking perspective on that. And I think that's one of the things which has completely fallen by the wayside within the South African context. Mainly, as a result of lack of capacity, but also lack of data. And I want to comment with regards to Mark's comments on that I think it's vitally important that we create some sort of collaborative analytic hub where state, private sector, and civil society can all pool their data for the specific country. It's great that it's being done on an international level through GTOC and with the ACT program on a more regional level, but I think there needs to be some sort of initiative, and I'm not sure if government will ever take that initiative to build that data driven analytic hub where there can be a much more detailed scrutiny of the actors, of the modus operandi, in order to then develop your operational strategies around that. The point with regards to our countering approaches links up with this. And that is that we've had in recent years, we have the drug master plan, we've got the national anti-gang strategy, we've got the wildlife strategy, Francis is driving. We've got the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. We've got the Violence Prevention and Crime, or the Violence and Crime Prevention Strategy. If you do a cross-cutting analysis of all of that, the majority of them point to exactly the same things which are required, and yet there is an inability to take that same interventions, strengthen the law enforcement capacity, strengthen the resilience of the detection mechanisms, make it easier to pick up on where there's deviations, build the witness protection. It cuts across all of them. And yet there's a failure to implement them for the various independent areas. So it's possibly crucial that there will have to be some sort of higher level discussion about how we pull all of this together with the minimal resources and that sort of interventions in those scenario 2, which might make a change. So yeah, just a comment on that.
Thank you so much. Judith van der Merwe, if you can please switch on your microphone and pose your question or make your comment.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I have one short question. Thus far, we have spoken about the cooperation between the transnational organized crime groups in our neighboring countries. My question is, how much evidence or research have we done between the ideological terrorist organizations and the South African gangs? Thus far, the evidence that I've seen is quite limited. So my other question is, are there any risks of radicalization and opportunistic cooperation for logistics and finance between the ideological terrorist organizations and South African gangs? Thank you.
Very much for that. There are, you could please switch off your microphone. Thank you. There are 2 more hands that I've noted in the room before we round up comments, inputs, and thoughts, but I will come to those in a moment because there has been a number of issues raised, everything from justice sector engagement, reform and upskilling, budget, the space for collaboration, a collaborative analytic hub that is across sectors, and then this issue around the connection between criminal groups and gangs here in South Africa within the broader global ecosystem, specific here around terrorism and violent extremism, and whether radicalization is something we should be focusing and concerned about in a broad basket of issues that have been covered. So Mark, to you, colleagues, I have noted 2 hands. If you could please just re-raise your hands. 1, 2, besides repeat ones. Okay. Go ahead, Mark.
Thanks again. Thank you for the questions to Rose and to some degree to Colin. The model, if I remember correctly, also includes spending on the criminal justice system. So I think at least in the second model, there's a swap in to raise the volume of, or that's the proposal to achieve what we are projecting in that model. How much is, I don't know, and the model doesn't say that. I think we need to, I think that's the follow-on work. What we do know, which I think is very important, is that we need to spend on things that are low to pitch them up at a higher level and then make sure that we, at least in the second model, move on to other resilience indicators. I genuinely think criminal justice is an investment. It's an investment in a safer society which improves people's livelihoods. We too often think of it as a reactive process, which it is, but investing in it over time is crucial. I state the obvious, but I think that's very important. Related to that, I did say it in when I was presenting. But there's a positive cycle that emerges from the data. Once you can attack state-embedded actors, you can get a positive cycle going, which builds resilience more quickly and at a higher level. So to emphasize the critical importance in South Africa of making sure that state-embedded criminalized actors are not present. This is really the key point that rather obviously emerges from the data, but this is a global data set. On organized crime threat assessments, I think that's absolutely right. When we did ours, it generated an enormous amount of, were we 100% right? No, of course not. But it generated, as Julian and the team knows, an enormous amount of comment. And we presented it from the presidency downwards. And what does an assessment do? It gets people thinking and talking in the same narrative. And I think that's very important. I also think organized crime threat assessments should be public, or there should be a public version, because organized crime is not only the state's responsibility. And coming together with a common interpretation of what organized crime is central to bringing a broader institutional and societal response. I couldn't agree more. On your point about fragmented implementation and planning, I think there needs to be a national strategy on organized crime. There needs to be an independent mechanism to measure where the state is making success. There needs, in my view, to be an independent council. These are all things that we have proposed, where data comes, where it is provided, and where organized crime is measured. And we need to understand that this is a much more complicated issue than we've faced ever before in our broader criminality space, and that it is a threat to our national security. I don't say that lightly. It is genuinely unchecked a threat to our national security. So we should take it seriously. And I at least see in the political narrative that there is a change in how these things are talked about by the minister, the president, and others. And of course, I agree that we need to do something about it. The cannabis question was one I skipped, but not deliberately. Actually,
how did it come back to you, Mark?
In fact, I was in an interview with people in Durban yesterday who were running criminal organizations, but they were smoking the stuff. So maybe actually the cannabis it has declined if you look at the rating, that's one of the indicators that have declined, because when use is legalized or legalized in some way, then we don't consider it as much of a criminal market. I'm simplifying quite a long discussion, but just to answer the very good question. The ideological question is tough to answer, and there has, of course, been debates in the media, and I myself have written a book on Pagad, so I want to make 2 points. The first is, of course, where there are resources, there's a very strong correlation between conflict and organized crime in the index. It's so clear between conflict and places where there's disruption and non-state actors. And what are illicit markets? They're a source of funds, and you tax them if there's no state, or you draw money from them. They're also a source of powerful populist narratives to respond to them. And some of those have ideological content. Pagad happened to be a model, although people were there's a lot you can debate around that. But the point is that their political disruption comes from 2 causes. The rise of vigilante style operations, populism, authoritarian responses, you can see that globally very clearly, and being drawn on as a resource for both political, it's not only political and ideological power, let's say.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Annie Cox agrees with this idea around a collaborative analytic hub. but adds on to that it's crucial that such hub also be able to offer analytical capacity building. And I can't agree more with her point that beyond whoever initiates the process, that you also ensure that you have a steady stream of analysts and experts that can be able to take on that work. We do have 3 final hands. The word final is final. There in the corner, and then yourself, and then Karen. Please go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am, and good morning, sir. I am Major General Rabi. I'm the head of strategic management in SAPS, and I've been given the task to facilitate the development of a organized crime strategy, which we believe includes the transnational element of that. First of all, I must admit, it's been overwhelming, and it's been a roller coaster ride, because the moment that you think you understand organized crime, you take a dip and you realize that you don't. And I'm glad that I made the time this morning to come and, to look at your presentation, because in my view, it's excellent. and it's very valuable for the purpose of us as a country to develop a strategy to respond to organized crime. A lot of the things that you've said, we picked up not necessarily through research like you've presented, but through the opinions of people and the feedback that we got. And there's a couple of gaps that we've identified. You will find that, for instance, throughout the country in the different government departments, in the different stakeholders, there's a lot being done to address organized crime. And I think that is what has been keeping us afloat. The fact that everywhere you have these pockets of excellence that are actually doing something about organized crime. But in this, and this is my personal opinion, I'm not an expert in organized crime, I'm just facilitating the process. But what we've found is we are not yet at the level where there's true synergy between or in the processes that people, different departments and different entities, what they implement in the country. I believe that a lot more can be achieved if we can pull all of these efforts together. And I was quite impressed when I looked at the actions on your key actions in the document that you are recommending, that it's actually quite well aligned with what we are suggesting that needs to happen in the country. Now, there's a significant difference between saying this needs to happen and then getting to how are we going to get there and how are we going to do that. And the development team will appreciate if we can have an opportunity to further engage on this, because what we haven't found so far is concrete evidence of whether the country is winning the war against organized crime. Yes, there's a lot of stats that are being published, and I think what you've presented this morning is a very valuable tool that we need to embed, with your permission, in the submissions that we are going to make going forward. My last comment, the key intervention that we identified that needs to be implemented, which according to the feedback that we received should be the top priority, is establishing that hub that everybody is talking about, that will enable South Africa, not police or any individual departments, that will enable South Africa to have a 24/7 situational awareness of what is happening with organized crime. And when I refer to that, it's not only intelligence. From my perspective, there's a difference between information and intelligence. There's intelligence will tell you what are they going to do next, who's the people that are, the key role players in the processes, how they operate, etc. But you also need evidence to understand organized crime, how it works, how it evolves, and I think the work that you have been doing in this regard could help us a lot to get that understanding, so that at the end of the day, we get into a situation where South Africa, everybody knows about organized crime. We all have the same understanding. You will find that sorry, I'm going a long way now, but you will find that in different departments, they are investigating the same people, but we are not talking to each other. And that is the type of issues that we want to address through this the Organized Crime Center that we would like to establish at the end of the day, that will give us that 24/7 situational awareness. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Ma'am, thank you very much. Dr. Shaw, as an old teacher and lecturer, I will give you a cum laude for your monumental job. I'm highly impressed. There's one thing that pops up clearly to me, and that is the witness support. And a witness or a whistleblower is one of the most important things of information. Information equals later on intelligence, as the previous speaker mentioned. And as we know, intelligence is a power multiplier. I was sitting here in the same room a few weeks ago, and they was talking about the Black Axe. Black Axe situation is about 48 years old, was established in 1977, and it's amazing that a lot of people don't even know about it. And they are well and alive in South Africa, although they are illegal organization. Why is it that no intelligence people or less intelligence people pick that up and then sit down and we build a picture, as the previous mentioned? I listened to all the speakers. Intelligence was a little hide away somewhere. I mean, from my point of view, that this is the most important thing. If you don't have information that refers later on to intelligence, you are totally blind. And according to my experience, is that the organized crime people have a vast form of intelligence, and they're running circles around us. That's my comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And then Corinne.
Question is maybe a little bit related to the timing and what Dr. Miyu has been asking. But a lot of the data, of course, is about continuous developments, slow changes. Is there something you find from the data that's relevant for South Africa that's related to more sudden or more impactful points, as in trigger points, that could be, I don't want to use the word looming, but say from your data, are elections, for instance, such an event quite often? In his book of Windows of Opportunities, you gave the example of the Western Cape. I don't know if you can say anything else about this window of opportunity identification, maybe on that example or others.
Thank you very much. Mark.
Again, thank you for the questions. They're just extraordinary, and I feel I don't always do them justice. But what makes me happy is that the index promotes debate, which is its objective. Thank you, Annie, for her comment. Major General Rabi, thank you very much. I know you're working on the strategy. I have 2 or 3 quick responses if I can. I really want to say that we have, and I know Jenny was assisting you, to come back to Jenny and Julian and others. We will do whatever we can. First point I want to make is that the simpler the strategy, the better. I think is in our experience around the world, because organized crime is so complicated. You can get driven down a million rabbit holes, and there's an argument for trying to keep it simple. Secondly, it needs leadership, and we mentioned the National Crime Prevention Strategy earlier. That was led at a ministerial level. I want to make the argument that you need higher level leadership to pull people together on these very complicated, wicked problems. Let's call it that. And so a hub brings the working actors together, but who do you hold to account for redactions? The third point to make about the index, which is that we've been approached by a number of countries to work with them to build the index, not only nationally, but subnationally. And I think so that would mean having an index by district, for example. I don't want to name the country because we are talking to them, and you could build. It comes back to the point that we have a criminal justice system, a criminal justice statistics system, which I know from my own period in government here very well, but that's not providing a complete picture. So we need something in parallel to that on illicit markets, a system that pulls together the data and allows the state to understand better what's going on, and a subnational index drawing on the lessons that we've learned at a global and national level, which can then be adapted for the requirements of every country, are very useful. And that's very true of big countries. South Africa is a big country, lots of resources. Brazil, there are others. And that then provides you a better sense, because organized crime occurs in different forms in different places. I completely agree. And indeed, we have analysts in Nigeria. One of the points our guys make on Black Axe is, of course, that people investigating it don't understand its history. And this is, for me, an important point of partnership between people looking at the immediate criminality and those that are talking to people in Black Axe, its histories, where it comes from, and how might be the pressure points related to the previous excellent questions. Karen, on timing, can I make a bigger question on timing, which is a really good place to finish? So thank you for the question. The reason I wanted to show the graph, which you corrected me on correctly, that it's not that organized crime is going down, but its growth is slowing. And that provides a massive opportunity for us. Along with the commissions that have been asked by a previous very good question, suggests now is the time for intervention. Because what do you need? You need both an institutional recognition and a political recognition, and the two come together, and that's where the state can begin to, and you need a disruption to this. And what the current Commission of Inquiry and the Parliamentary Commission is a disruption, however we see it. So we should not lose this opportunity. It's a once-in-a-generation opportunity, and then the space will close. And so from where I sit as a South African who clearly wants South Africa to be better, but from where many people in the audience who have a lot of influence here, this is an opportunity that we must not lose. There have been opportunities in the past that have passed. This is not one that we should let pass, not in a Machiavellian sense, but in the sense that there's a coalescence of the narrative that organized crime is a threat. There's enough disruption in the system and recognition that the system is being penetrated and needs change. And I think there's a recognition that a whole range of social partners, business playing an important role, but many others are now needed to respond. And last point to make, which I'd really like to end on, Ottilia, is what the index shows is that we can win. We can win. And so we best be working towards that goal.
Mark, I'm sure everyone in the room, both virtually here, will agree with me. You've done, beyond the index itself, a mammoth task. Charles Emma correctly says, illuminating presentation and fielding so many difficult questions, comments, and issues. So really immense appreciation from our side in terms of your input. Colleagues, this event is, of course, fully on the record, and a video of this event will be available both on the ISS and the ENACT website. It's an extremely difficult topic to paraphrase or even summarize, so I'm certainly not going to attempt to do so. What I will say is that across the room, we have had inputs from 19 of you, allowing for a range of issues to be raised. Everything from money laundering to what kind of models can work, to reflections on how political will is a critical element of addressing all of these issues, beyond commissions of inquiry, to engaging across sectors, faith-based institutions, civil society, non-governmental organizations being part of that. But realizing, as much as we're talking about South Africa today, that this is very much not a South Africa only issue and problem. So even where it relates to South Africa, we also need to be involving neighboring countries, broader afield, as far afield as Anna alluded to, as Indonesia, in terms of countries that we need to be engaging and focusing in. A lot of the issues that we cover require brave people to be able to bring them to the fore. Some of those are victims, some of those are witnesses, some of them are insiders and people whistleblowing, and the system has to be able to ensure that their views are seen, heard, but they are protected or shielded from the potential fallout as a result. Whether we're talking about copper theft, or the fisheries, wildlife, or whether we're dealing with who can be involved in responding to the issues from the private sector to the justice sector itself, one thing came up in various inputs. It was that there's no single sector that can address these issues that we've discussed today on its own. Collaboration is not just about response. Collaboration is about prevention. It is about data, information gathering. It is about the critical role that intelligence plays in allowing us to be able to do the hard work of building resilience, but also of preventing. Those of you who provided input, you might not have noticed, but we ensured gender balance. We also ensured that your inputs came from the policing sector, criminal justice, forestries, fisheries, wildlife and environment. Immigration and border management issues were raised, violence prevention, the role of faith-based communities, politics, both from those that support political involvement and engagement, including political foundations, those that work on transport and logistics, security, counter and anti-corruption, community leaders, researchers and analysts, and those from the private sector and intelligence. Why do I list all of these and the varied inputs that we received? Because what Mark said at the start and what many of you have reflected, which is this is a whole of society working together effort, is reflected in the people in the room. Importantly, we started at about 90 people and we're currently at 83, both in the room and virtually. And that speaks to the interest in the topic and remaining engaged. I will end with a quote from you, Mark. You cannot arrest your way out of criminality. In the list of actors, yes, the police were mentioned. Yes, the National Prosecuting Authority was referred to. There were comments that spoke to judges as well. But everyone else was part of that basket. So if what you say is correct, Mark, and I think I certainly agree with you, you can't arrest your way out of criminality. It's only one part of the puzzle. The rest of the puzzle requires different institutions represented in this room, those of you that have joined us online, also being on board in how do we get South Africa, which, as Mark reminds us, is already in a unique position. High crime, high resilience, still a democratic society with a diverse landscape, both on crime and on response. And finally, if we target key areas of resilience, short to medium term, those incremental steps can help us reach that peachy picture starting in 2046. But I certainly hope that we do it a little bit earlier than 2046. The task is certainly not mine. All I had to do was moderate this event. The task is all of you in this room, as well as, of course, my organization, the Institute for Security Studies, that continues to support and do this work. And we're thankful for the ENACT team, Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, the ISS itself, Interpol, some of you are in this room, as well as those that continue to fund and support the work. ENACT itself is funded by the European Union, but the Global Index would not have been possible without the funding, additional funding from the Norwegian Ministry for Foreign Affairs, as well as the government of the United States. Colleagues, those of you online, please go grab lunch if you have it. Those of you in the room, the ISS has got you covered. Thank you very much.